We all know the story. It is the most famous wrong turn in history. June 28, 1914. The driver makes a mistake, the car stalls, and Archduke Franz Ferdinand is staring down the barrel of a pistol. 2 shots ring out, the dominoes fall, and within weeks, millions of men are marching into the mud. That is the version they teach in school. It is clean, it is linear, and it makes sense. A political assassination triggered a political war. But what if that story is, at best, a convenient cover-up? What if the real fuse wasn't lit by a Serbian nationalist in the Balkans, but by a distinct group of men sitting in plush leather chairs in London, Paris, and New York? Men who never touched a rifle, but whose fountain pens signed death warrants for an entire generation. The truth is, by 1914, the great powers of Europe weren't just political rivals. They were bankrupt gamblers playing a high-stakes game of poker with money they didn't have. The war wasn't just about borders or alliances, it was a liquidation event, a foreclosure on an era of reckless imperialism, and the people holding the mortgage, they needed a war to balance the books. So, forget the Archduke for a moment. To understand why the world actually burned, we have to follow the money, and the money trail leads us to a terrifying reality. The First World War was bought and paid for long before the first shot was fired. Let's peel back the gilded curtain of the early 20th century. This was the Belle Époque, the beautiful era. On the surface, Europe was thriving. Industrial smokestacks were churning, trade was booming, and the empires of Britain and France controlled half the globe. But if you looked at the ledgers, the foundation was rotting. The major European powers were drowning in debt. Imperialism is expensive, extremely expensive. Britain and France had spent decades gobbling up Africa and Asia, seizing resources like rubber, oil, and gold. But maintaining those colonies required massive armies, navies, and infrastructure. They were leveraging their future tax revenues to pay for today's expansion. The British Empire, the supposed master of the world, was structurally terrified. They were the old wealth, the trust fund kid of geopolitics, desperate to maintain a lifestyle they could no longer afford. Then you had the Disruptor. Germany. Germany was the new tech giant on the block, unified late in 1871. They had better steel, better chemicals, and a more efficient industry than Britain. But they had a problem. They had arrived too late to the colonial party. The world had already been carved up. Germany needed raw materials to feed its economic engine, but they were locked out of the global markets by British and French tariffs. Berlin was borrowing heavily from its own banks to build a navy strong enough to challenge Britain, not for glory, but for economic survival. This created a financial powder keg. The entire global economy was tied together by the gold standard. Every currency, the pound, the franc, the mark, was pegged to physical gold. It sounded stable, but it was a trap. If a country bought more than it sold, gold flowed out of its vaults to pay the difference. If your vaults went empty, your currency collapsed, your credit vanished, and your government fell. By 1914, everybody was terrified of their vaults going empty. It was a zero-sum game. For Germany to get rich, Britain had to get poorer. The trade war was already hot long before the shooting started. The British strategy was simple: blockade Germany economically, cut off their credit, and starve their industry. The German response was equally desperate: expand or die. And sitting above this chaos were the merchant banks, the houses of Rothschild in London and Paris, the Warburgs in Hamburg, and the looming giant across the ocean, the House of Morgan in New York. These weren't just banks, they were sovereign entities. They didn't just lend money, they underwrote governments. Here is where the narrative shifts from incompetence to malice. When the war started, the public was told it would be over by Christmas. Why? Because every economist knew that modern war was too expensive to last longer than a few months. But the bankers knew differently. They saw an opportunity that comes once in a millennium. As the armies stalled and the trenches were dug, the governments of Europe burned through their gold reserves in weeks. They needed cash, billions of it. They turned to the only people who had it: private financiers. This is the pivot point where the war stopped being a political conflict and became a business venture. Take a look at the House of Morgan. J.P. Morgan Jr., the son of the legendary tycoon, saw the war in Europe not as a tragedy, but as a market. He didn't just lend money. He became the purchasing agent for the British and French empires. If the British army needed boots, bullets, or beef, they bought it through Morgan. And Morgan took a commission on every single item. But the Allies couldn't pay in cash. They paid in IOUs. Morgan, floated massive loans bonds sold to American investors to pay for the war effort. We are talking about billions of dollars in 1915 money. Adjusted for inflation and economic scale, the sums are unfathomable today. The neutrality of the United States was a sham, while President Woodrow Wilson was preaching peace to the public. Wall Street was betting the house on an Allied victory. But here is the engaging hook that history books leave out. By 1916, the gamble was failing. Germany was winning. Their submarines were sinking the supply ships. Russia was collapsing into revolution. The French army was mute. The Allies were on the brink of default. If Britain and France lost the war, the bonds would be worthless. The House of Morgan would face insolvency. The American economy, which was now booming thanks to war manufacturing, would crash into a depression overnight. The bankers had leveraged the entire future of the United States on the success of the British Empire. They couldn't afford peace. A negotiated peace, a draw, would mean no reparations and no way to pay back the debts. The only way the bankers would get their money back is if Germany was crushed completely and forced to pay for everything. So, the war had to expand. This brings us to the most controversial aspect of the conflict, the entry of the United States. We are told it was about the Lusitania or the Zimmermann telegram Germany trying to get Mexico to invade Texas. Those were the headlines. Sure, but the subtext was in the ledger. In early 1917, the American ambassador to London, Walter Hines Page, sent a secret cable to the State Department. He didn't talk about democracy or freedom. He talked about liquidity. He warned that the British gold reserves were gone and that a financial collapse was imminent unless the US government stepped in to guarantee the loans. Weeks later, the United States declared war. Thousands of young American men were shipped to Europe to break the stalemate, and they did. But let's look at who really won when the guns went silent on November 11, 1918. The soldiers came home to a Spanish flu pandemic and a recession. The empires of Europe were shattered. The map was redrawn, but in the boardrooms of New York and London, champagne corks were popping. The Treaty of Versailles, often called a peace treaty, was actually a debt collection instrument. The terms imposed on Germany were mathematically impossible to fulfill. Why? Because the Allies needed to extract enough money from Germany to pay back the American bankers. It was a cycle of madness. Germany borrowed money from American banks to pay reparations to Britain and France, who then used that money to pay back their war loans too. The American banks, the bankers were collecting interest on every side of the triangle dot. The war shifted the financial center of gravity of the world. Before 1914, London was the king. After 1918, New York was the emperor. The United States went from being a debtor nation to the world's creditor. The modern American century was purchased with the blood of the Somme and Verdun. But the story doesn't end there. The financial weapons developed during this era: sovereign debt traps, economic sanctions. The weaponization of currency became the blueprint for the next 100 years. When you look at the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany, where people carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, that wasn't an accident of nature. That was the direct result of a financial system designed to squeeze a defeated nation until it broke, and break it did, leading directly to the rise of fascism and the Second World War. The bankers who secretly started WWI didn't just fund a conflict. They engineered a world order where finance trumps sovereignty. They proved that if you control the debt, you control the armies. It's a chilling realization. We like to think of history as a series of decisions made by leaders in uniforms or suits, debating morality and strategy. But often, the real decisions are made in quiet rooms. Based on interest rates and bond yields, the men in the mud thought they were fighting for their country. In reality, they were fighting to secure the balance sheet of a bank across the ocean. The tragedy of World War I isn't just the loss of life, it's the industrialization of death for profit. As we look at the conflicts in the world today, look past the headlines, look past the political rhetoric, ask the question that solved the mystery of 1914. Who is funding it? Who holds the debt? And what happens to the money when the shooting stops? History is not just what happened, it's who paid for it to happen. And usually, the receipt is hidden in the archives, waiting for someone to dust it off and read the fine print.